ultimately. So does anyone have any questions about that? Is anyone ready to engage in ethical deliberation using a rational reconstruction of your everyday intuitions embedded in the practices of your community?
Well,
Dr. Jameson.
I happen to know a few lawyers, and my gut feeling on how they would enter into this discussion would be an emphasis on their careers and how important it is for them to win. So how would you? I realize you've got their associations, their role, and everything, but that would be the emphasis, I think, on their part. So I wonder how you would react to that part of their argument.
Well, so I think any kind of success in a career depends. Depends on success in a particular kind of context in which you have a role that you've agreed to, right? In a larger context which might only reward certain kinds of behavior over others. I think, on our view, those kinds of contexts have to be taken into account, and one has to determine where the allegiances lie, what kinds of reasons make sense. I think, on our view, and Dr. Kelly emphasized the feelings portion of this, maybe I'm going to emphasize the reasons portion. These particular social roles don't just come with particular kinds of identities that enable us to do something. The identity of a lawyer, right, enables you to stand in front of a courtroom, make particular kinds of arguments, and people listen to those arguments. But also binds you to have to provide certain kinds of explanations, certain kinds of reasons, reasons. And so, as I think about what it takes to win as a lawyer, to have success as a lawyer, I have to think about who I owe those reasons to, who I owe those explanations to, and in some case too, what is just, what are fair kinds of arrangements between these different roles that I occupy. Yeah, beholden as a lawyer, code of ethics. I guess the push of our view is the lawyer does owe himself and others those explanations, winning at what cost, and coming to terms with that, and fighting for a more just system due to the social role.
Yeah, and I would just echo that on our view, the lawyer has to, if at all possible, actually engage in deliberation with the client and the other people who are affected, and at least either, if they can't do it actually, at least by proxy, in other words, finding trusted advisors that they could speak to about this, or worst, at least in their imagination, would it be sufficient? I mean, could they see telling that witness, oh yes, I impeached and humiliated you on the stand and convinced the jury that you were lying, when in fact I knew you were telling the truth because it was good for my career to win. And could you imagine, that, again, in real deliberation, would that be a sufficient reason? Again, we're not shooting for consensus, but would at least the witness be like, oh, I see that's reasonable and I still trust you, right? And again, remember, the damage from not doing that kind of stuff is palpable, right? I mean, lawyers have an awful reputation in our society, right? They have an awful reputation with jurors. Many lawyers are deeply unhappy people, right? And in part because many lawyers believe that their job on a routine basis violates their own sense of ethical integrity. And in part, yeah, because some feel that they're placed in a position where they have hundreds of thousands of dollars of student loans and they need to win and they need to make money, right? In other cases, it's because they feel that they're placed in an adversarial system, whereas many lawyers tell me finding the truth and arriving at justice is not the goal of the system anymore, right? It's about winning. And so there's major, there's major, as Hegel would say, that's serious damage to ethical life that is made by taking that kind of perspective, that winning and advancing my career counts as a sufficient reason for why I should exercise the role this way. Now I have to admit, wouldn't it have been a lot easier if I just said, the categorical imperative will cause you pain when you think like that, Bill, right? I mean,
I thought it was an absolutely wonderful paper. I mean, exactly the kind of direction that that we're going in. I think Bernard Williams also said that no moral theory will tell you what is right, what is wrong, and what you ought to do. And so you need a much more capacious way of thinking about our moral dilemmas. And when we think about, Kant, and sort of the rule-based, just the recent history of ethical discourse as being really an attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You've got the anemic appeal to abstract rules, to abstract people. Impartiality is the only standard. And then you have virtue ethics, McIntyre, bringing that back in, and then you have Nell Noddings and care ethics, and then you have somaticity, Schusterman, and then you have affect, Michael Stowe, Bob Solomon, the passion for justice. So I think everything that we're doing in trying to think through these kinds of issues are going in precisely the direction that you're going here, getting away from this kind of fragmented, if it's moral, it's not ethical, you can't put these two things together. I think that is precisely the right direction. The only one concern that I would have is Amartya Sen's criticism of Rawls, where he worries a little bit about the way in which we use the word reason. He begins, the idea of justice as opposed to the theory of justice, where ideas require that are prospective, they're creative, so how do we develop an idea of justice? In looking at these different positions, deontic, utilitarian, and so on, they all have good reasons, and they all have to be taken into consideration. So there's not a reason that disqualifies another reason. That what we need is we need to get a whole bunch of reasons that are often conflicted, and your deliberation, and deal with them in a pragmatic way. So the only sort of caveat that I would have is how are we using the term reason?
Dr. Kelly, who loves Rawls, will definitely want to respond to this question. But before he does so, when I talk about reasons, I do think about it in a deliberative context. And so what we owe to one another is not just as sentient beings, as beings that feel, right, and have common experiences together, but as beings who have understanding. What I mean by that is our lives need to make sense to ourselves and to one another. And when we call out for explanations from one another, we understand that move in a way. We understand the need, right, to hear something which makes sense. And so when we talk about reasons in a deliberative context, it is an activity in a way, an activity among concrete individuals that owe that to one another in virtue of the roles that they've taken on and the expectations that they've set up. But it is a process of understanding.
Yeah, and I guess I would say think about it in two ways. In one way, the way I'm sort of envisioning the project, particularly the ethical deliberation type project, is sort of unpacking. If you took Rawls and gave him a healthy dose of feminism, a little bit of Habermas, what would reasonability mean? Or sort of an important concept for him, right? And so and Rawls, I think, at times talks very monologically about reasonability, right? The sort of like the idea that that I understand that I'm fallible, that I understand that I have to exchange reasons with others, that I have to try to secure their consent, that I am a co-participant in these kinds of discussions. And we would like, in some degree, what we're trying to do is unpack this idea of reasonability by further including my emotional responses to these kinds of interactions, the relationships and the value of those relationships in those kinds of interactions. So one, we're trying to, I think of it as enriching the concept of reasonability. Now, when it comes to what are the reasons then that get exchanged in deliberation, I'm not sure. I hate that. So my initial thought is they're claims, right? But I think to some degree we're trying to build in more of this emotive reaction as well, right? The somatic reaction. I cut my teeth on continental philosophy, and so I think Levinas here, right? I think about about that. What is that sort of like phenomenological reaction of the face-to-face? And in some sense, that's a test, right? It's a kind of canary in the coal mine, right? That if I think, if even trying to explain, offering you claims as to why I'm going to do something, if that in and of itself starts making my gut turn in a very negative, then that's a red flag, right? That should be telling me something right there. So mostly I think about the reason exchange in terms of claims, but I would say I would recognize a need to build more emotive and somatic content into that. But mostly I'm thinking of reasons in terms of claims that individuals would make.
You have time?
We have time for one more question.
So back to that example about winning versus respecting the opposition and their feelings. So I see that as for that, like there's an economic strata or sphere of our society, and there's kind of the justice, and that's a conflict between two spheres. You'd say, of course, what do we pay lawyers for is to win. We want to win to avoid the pain. That's kind of the incentive of that whole structure. Yet we don't want to be treated unfairly, so we have this justice regard. How do you adjudicate between whole different systems? I think that exemplifies that conflicting or incommensurable kind of split that often is just focused on one sphere, as in like justice between two parties. But these are like competing spheres of like the society itself. To me, I feel that's where the idea of like moral principles came, is to have some sort of outlying perspective standard. But how do you kind of adjudicate between that? Or just, if you don't have time, just that question I think is interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Here's the way I think about it is that I would not start and I would not advise Boethius to think about the economic sphere and the justice sphere as two different social spheres. We're thinking about this in terms of as a kind of like role ethics type idea. So the idea would be, let's begin with again a rational reconstruction of your particular role. Now, what would that mean? That would mean, and then this is part of it where you can't armchair it. It seems to be that one has to think through carefully what are the practices that lawyers engage in, and what are the intuitions that they have when they engage in those practices, and from that create some formal rules or some ideals that one can use within your deliberations. And so, the question is, if you do a rational reconstruction of the lawyer, do you arrive at the essence of the lawyer is to win? I'm not entirely sure of that, to be honest, right? I think we know lawyers who think that way, but boy, we also probably all know lawyers who don't think. I know plenty of lawyers that would not impeach the truthful witness, and they would say, I don't do so because it's unethical. And, remember, they're both economic agents, but they're also members of the justice system. And so what I would say, it would seem to me, as you rationally reconstruct that role, you're going to see both of those concerns, the economic concerns and the justice concern, get caught up into that reconstruction. And that you'll arrive at ideals or some basic rules that will hopefully adjudicate that. Now, again, you may arrive, it may be that the role simply is naked, it's naked self-interest, right? But then you'd have your second question, and well, if that's what the role fundamentally is about, is that role justified? What is the good that's promoted by that role, right? And then you may find that there's no justification, or you may find that there are good justifications for that role. And then, again, all of that would then have a sort of like feedback loop back to Boethius' decision. Given the ideal rules of being a lawyer, given what this role is all about, and that given the justifications for this role, that's going to provide context for me to think through how I should act in this particular way. Or more importantly, the way we're thinking about it, that's going to give me reasons or resources that I can take to the people I'm in these relationships with, and when I deliberate with them and try to explain to them. So for instance, if I try to explain, Boethius explains to his client, I chose not to impeach the truthful witness, or even better, explains to his client at the beginning, I don't impeach truthful witnesses, right? And here's why. What are the kinds of reasons that are going to secure at least the continued trust of that of that client. And again, my suspicion is that there's just not going to be a whole lot of context for simply saying, my naked self-interest makes me do this. There's not a lot of context in the real world. You know, we sort of like reify the economy as this world where we're like these Hobbesian strategic actors, but that's not real life, right? I mean, it's never like that. We're real people in real interactions with people that we know at varying levels, but they're other human beings that we know. And so in some sense, I'd like to resist a little bit that strong bifurcation between the economic sphere, where we're just sort of like these naked Hobbesians, and the justice sphere, where we're Rawlsians, right? I'd like to sort of like see how the relationships and the roles permeate into the economic side.